We are taking a look now at ecology. So if I haven't already, help me remember you need a new pocket and new tab, and the biomes that we've been discussing is kind of the in-between talking about climate and our atmosphere and hydrosphere and talking about the living things that live in those areas because of the climate, the precipitation, and the temperature. So now that we know about different biomes and what conditions are present, we can look at the living things there and the relationship between them. So we're going to look first at general ecology. And the important thing to remember about ecology and ecosystems is that everything is connected together. The plants are connected to the animals are all connected to each other. The soil and the rain are all connected to the plants and the amount of sunlight. Everything is connected to make things the way that they are. You can't remove one thing without it impacting so many other things. So an ecosystem is all the organisms that are living in the area and the environment itself. So if we're talking about an oak forest or a coral reef or a vacant lot, it's the soil, the sunlight, the precipitation, the plants, the snails, the raccoons, everything in there is connected. And they are not only connected maybe by eating or being eaten, but also they pass energy and they pass nutrients from one to the other. So animals, seeds, water, the soil, everything is connected in our ecosystem. So those things that can be passed around, they could be energy, they could be mineral nutrients like coming from the soil, they could be carbon dioxide, water, oxygen, or even living organisms themselves being passed around. Now, when we talk about the things in an ecosystem, some are living things. Those are our biotic factors. They're living or they come from a living thing. So animals and plants definitely, but also dead animals and plants or leaves that fall from trees. They were once living. They're part of a living thing, but they're not walking around talking, right? Or waste products. Those are all considered biotic factors. They have to do with living things. Then you have abiotic factors, which are not living. A, that little prefix means not, abiotic. So these are your non-living parts, the air, the water, the rocks, the sand, the soil, the temperature, the light. Those are all not having to do with living organisms. So those organisms are individual living things. So like a snail would be an organism. If you have a whole bunch of the same types of organisms, then you have a species. A species is a group of organisms, and those species are all the same. They can mate, they can produce fertile offspring. So example, Homo sapiens, people, we are a species. Canis lupus, wolves, those are a species. Pinus taeda, loblolly pine, that is a species. They're all the same. Now they have variations within that population, within that species. You know, some of us Homo sapiens have brown hair, some of us have blonde hair, but we could produce fertile offspring. A population is all the members of that same species that live in a particular place. So loblolly pine would be the species, but we might look at a population of loblolly pine that lives on a particular pine plantation in Rusk County. You might have a bunch of field mice, but we're looking as a population at just the field mice that live in this one field. So when we do population studies, we're not talking about every African lion known to man. We're talking about the African lions living in that area of savanna. Okay, so population is within a certain area. And then within that certain area, it's not just that one species. There's many other species living there too. So a community is groups of several different species that all live in the same place and interact. So going back to our savanna, it could be the lions and the giraffes and the elephants and the snails and the bugs that crawl. So our communities only involve our living things, our biotic, could be the plants, could be the animals, could be the fungus, could be the bacteria, but it doesn't include the abiotic. The ecosystem does. So communities is biotic, the living things. The ecosystem as a whole does include our soil and water and rocks and all that good stuff. So here's just kind of a graphic of those 4 levels of organization. You can see the individual gazelle, antelope, whatever that is, down there. And so that one individual, along with his fellow members of his species, make up a population. Then the community involves, you can see also the ostrich and the zebra and the wildebeest. And then the ecosystem, you see they kind of take a step back and look at everything, the weather that's there, the air, the water, the soil. So where the organism lives is a habitat. And we talked a little bit about habitat with biome. Every biome has certain conditions that it exists in. Well, that habitat where the organism lives is perfectly suited, or maybe the organism is perfectly suited for that habitat. There's specific conditions that live there. There's certain biotic conditions, other things that live there. There's abiotic factors, things that it needs to live there. So the type of soil, amount of rainfall, the other things that it eats or that eats it. So a habitat is where the organism lives and how well it's adapted for that place. Now, habitats can change, ecosystems can change. They don't stay static all the time. And some can be big, giant changes, and then some can be smaller. When a habitat or an ecosystem, when it changes, we undergo what's called ecological succession. So ecological succession is the process of change and replacement. It's changing communities. You can see here in this picture, we started off with just rocks. Maybe we had a volcano erupt and that volcano spewed igneous rock everywhere and we started just rock. Each new community that moves into that area, the rock, of course, is just abiotic. There's nothing living there. Then you get little lichens and moss living on the rock, and each community makes it easier for the next community to move in. I wonder why it says harder for the previous to survive. Anyway. Oh, I know. They're out competing. Sorry. I had a moment. Sorry. Each new community. So like the grasses shade out the mosses. The shrubs take over where the grasses are. Okay, I see. Sorry. So each community paves the way for the next community. And then that next community crowds out the previous community. Sorry. I had a moment. Okay. And then eventually there's a community that's stable at the end. So depending on the biome, that depends on what that climax community would look like. In the picture down here, that climax community is a beech and sugar maple big forest. In an area like our grasslands that doesn't get that much precipitation, maybe our climax community is literally just grasslands. Maybe that is the climax community. It doesn't go beyond that. Two types of succession. The big difference between these two is whether or not there was soil there to begin with. So primary succession in an area where there was no life before, there's just rocks from a lava flow or sand dunes from a brand new beach that's being deposited. There where there was no fertile soil yet, you are starting from scratch. That's primary succession. You have to start from the very beginning and build up your layers of soil for the plants that come after it to move in and be stable. Secondary succession occurs where there was something there before, but it got destroyed. So perhaps an area was wiped out after a storm or a flood. Maybe an earthquake shook everything down or a forest fire came through. There used to be a community there, but it got wiped out and now we have to start over. That's secondary succession. Primary succession is very slow. It can take hundreds to thousands of years to go from bare rock, like you see here on the left, all the way to a thick layer of soil that's capable of supporting a climax community of a forest. You have to start with like your lichens and the things that erode that rock, and eroding the rock creates a thin layer of that sand and that soil, and then the small plants can move in and then they too break up the rock and make more small particles and soil. And so each one, we talked a little bit about the legumes and how they had those nitrogen fixing bacteria on their nodules that put nitrogen into the soil. Those have to come in and prep the soil so that other things can live there. So it takes a very, very long time to do. The very first species that move into an area, you can see down here on our left arrow, are pioneer species. These are the very first things that can move into an area. Usually they're bacteria or lichens. They're trying to break down that rock and create some kind of soil for all the other plants that come after it to live. Now, what's lichen? Okay, lichen is kind of a mossy thing. It's actually two different species. You can see a picture of it here. It's a fungus and it's an algae. They live in relationship together. The algae will make sugars from photosynthesis, if it's plant. And then the fungus will take nutrients from the rock and also hold on to water. So they work together. And the process of putting those little tendrils in and holding onto the rock eventually breaks it down. Also, when you create those cracks, then you've made areas where water can get in and it may freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw. And it also, that chemical process, physical weathering, that physical process will break down the rock. And slowly but surely you get an accumulation of soil. Then those dead lichens, once they move on, they can add to that soil, and through a very long process, we get thicker and thicker sediments, thicker and thicker soil, and more nutrients in there, and then you can have your next stage move in. So a strange type of secondary succession we've started seeing since the dawn of man, I guess you would say, where people have lived. We get this process called urban succession, which is a type of secondary succession. There have been communities there before, but we moved in and paved over it. So the pavement, the sidewalk, is almost like a lava flow. It's hard rock. So you would think it would be primary because you're starting over from nothing, but yet there are still seeds in their soil way under there. So it's a weird mix. You've probably seen this all over the place, these cracks in the sidewalk. The plants will establish themselves and start growing, and then they push. Their root systems will push on that concrete or those bricks and start splitting it apart. If you've ever seen some of those shows on Discovery Channel, like what happens if humans disappear just suddenly, you might have seen this. The plants will come in and they'll start taking over and pushing things apart, and eventually even our urban areas, middle of Dallas, will return to the community that's supposed to be there based on the temperature and precipitation. Now, secondary succession, you've got something that came through and wiped it out. In the picture below, it's a wildfire, but notice underneath that fire, you already have soil started. So it's actually a faster process than primary succession because you already have that soil layer there. And then the process itself, very similar. You've got pioneer species that come in first and prepare the way. They're the ones that are really tough and can grow anywhere. And then after those pioneer, you start getting bigger and bigger grasses and shrubs, and then eventually small trees, and then bigger trees, and you get that final climax community, that stable community that's perfectly suited for that biome, that temperature and precipitation. All right, so another type of succession that you notice around East Texas is what we call old field succession. You had farmland or ranch land, but it's been abandoned. And so eventually through time, you notice the grasses, the weeds, the taller plants, and then it returns back to the climax community that should exist in that area. And finally, let's look at fire. Now, fire, it can actually be beneficial. It's a natural part of many ecosystems, and it's a natural cause of secondary succession. Some species are actually adapted to fire behavior. And so after intense heat, that might be a signal to pine trees to drop their seeds to reproduce. It also helps to remove accumulated down leaves and limbs and brush that could cause even worse fires or could prevent low-growing shrubs and plants from growing, and it returns nutrients to the soil. Some animals prefer the vegetation that grows right after the land has been cleared by a wildfire. So wildfires we think of as a bad thing, but it's actually a natural part of our ecosystem and can be very beneficial when not completely out of control. So that is our intro to ecology and our ecological systems, and we will look tomorrow at how energy moves through our ecosystems.